Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me. It's such an honor. And thank you, Laura, for the introduction. Though I must say, Laura, that one thing that you said I wanted to push back on. You said that if there had been a socialist magazine at the time of Martin Luther King Jr., like the magazine that I worked for, Jacobin, then perhaps things would have moved in a better direction, or he wouldn't have had to make the statement that he made. There was a very popular socialist magazine in the United States at the time. It was called Ramparts Magazine. It was targeted by the FBI's anti-radical COINTELPRO organization, which also targeted civil rights movement leaders, including Martin Luther King. But it wasn't by far the most popular socialist magazine in American history, neither is Jacobin. The most popular was called Appeal to Reason. Appeal to Reason was very popular in the early 20th century. It was most commonly associated with the American Union leader and socialist movement leader Eugene Debs, who was arrested for speaking out against World War I, thrown in jail, where he contracted diseases that upon his release led to his early death and the demise of that wave of the American socialist movement. So, there's plenty of free speech in America, but let's not delude ourselves. It has its limits, right? Now, I'm going to try to appeal to your reason on this point. I want to distinguish between two different definitions of the American dream. I think this is a really interesting conversation about whether or not there is such a thing. I think that there are two different definitions of the American dream. I think that the first one is the dream of ordinary people, and the second one is the dream of a small elite minority in politics and industry. So ordinary people dream of freedom and security. They dream of a society where their basic needs are met, where they're liberated and enabled to build loving, strong families and deep, meaningful connections and relationships and communities, and pursue passions of the heart and mind, and take full advantage of the beauty and enjoyment that the world has to offer. These are universal desires, they're not American ones. But America has promised since its inception to be, or at least strive to become, that place, and to welcome and nourish those who seek to pursue this dream. That's the spirit of the words that are inscribed at the base of the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. The dream of the Honduran immigrant in California, the dream of the Nigerian immigrant in New York, and the Vietnamese immigrant in Houston, Texas, the dream of my ancestors who came from Britain and France and Germany looking for freedom and security. This dream is no menace to the globe, not at all. So I'm here speaking in favor of the proposition, though, which is that the American dream has become a global nightmare. I think that the former dream, the dream of ordinary people, it's beautiful. It's a definitionally human vision. And to the extent that America has promised to be a society in which this dream could be realized, that is a noble thing. But America has never fulfilled that promise for its own citizens, be they immigrant or native-born, nor has it fulfilled its promise to be a beacon and protector of democracy around the world, ensuring that the dream can be realized in other countries as well. The reason for its failure is that economic and political elites in America dream differently. Their American dream has had disastrous consequences around the world. It is in this sense that the American dream has become a global nightmare. Especially since the 20th century, the American century, they called it, American political and economic elites have aspired to achieve two primary objectives. The first is to remove obstacles to the global circulation of capital. And the second is to preserve American geopolitical dominance. In pursuit of the latter, as Isra wonderfully summarized, the United States spends more on its military than the next 9 countries combined, the largest margin in recorded history. That's one country which has 85% of the world's foreign military bases, roughly 800 in 70 countries. And from these bases, the United States embarks on special missions and wages open warfare. The consequences of these activities are immense. America's unofficial military activities and dirty wars around the world have a well-documented tendency to destabilize countries, to exacerbate tensions, to create vacuums in which violent forces emerge, which repress and terrorize local populations. And that's just the dirty wars. As for open warfare, take the disaster of the American invasion and occupation of Iraq as an example. Hundreds of thousands of Iraqis were killed violently during the Iraq War. Over 1 million died, what are called excess deaths. caused by the disarray and degradation of their society, and millions more were displaced, both internally and externally. Ask an Iraqi refugee who has yet to return home, who has lost friends and family to the violence of war, who is injured and maimed psychically or mentally, whether the American dream has become a global nightmare. But the dream of American elites is not restricted to global domination. Its other objective is to remove existing barriers to and create new openings for the expansion and penetration of capital into new territories across the globe, particularly, but not exclusively, US capital. This, too, has had devastating consequences for the world. In the 1970s, a decades-long frenzy of global capital accumulation finally culminated in a severe crisis of profitability. In response, the United States sought to forcibly open new territory for profitable investment and production, especially in the global South and newly decolonized countries. For some well-positioned residents of those countries, that was not the worst thing in the world. They profited from the arrangement with Western capital, but they are a minority. For the masses, it's been a totally different story. The process with much more lasting effects has been the ensuing race to the bottom. As poorer countries tried to entice Western capital and outcompete each other by offering the cheapest labor, the most attractive tax schemes, the most lax regulations, and the greatest willingness to part with their own natural resources, people suffered, often fleeing land dispossession and environmental destruction caused by reckless expansion of new industry backed by Western capital, which again was the project of the United States in the latter half of the 20th century and remains so. People in the third world began flooding into megacities. Today, tens of millions live in slums in unconscionable conditions. If they're lucky, they can escape by working for a cheap consumer goods manufacturer making a few dollars a day. Their present condition is a result of the global restructuring of the economy along neoliberal lines spearheaded explicitly by the United States. Ask the residents of shantytowns in Sao Paulo and Cairo and Port-au-Prince and Manila. Ask the people who trawl landfills by day and then return to cinder block cubicles to sleep at night whether the American dream has become a global nightmare. Ask factory workers in Mexico and Bangladesh who spend every waking hour producing cheap consumer goods, which, by the way, are consumed primarily by Americans, under roofs that may collapse or catch fire, or on factory campuses that resemble prisons. Ask them whether the American dream has become a global nightmare. No. Through its proxies in the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, the United States has used financial coercion to force governments to undertake US-approved programs of austerity and privatization. And it has supported right-wing insurgencies and coups to produce political outcomes more favorable to the interests of US and other foreign capital. Contrary to its reputation as a high-minded exporter of democracy, the US is, above all, an exporter of neoliberalism. And in this capacity, it has often openly and shamefully flouted and subverted democracy, as it did in Jamaica, as it did in El Salvador, as it did in Chile, and that's just to name a few. So imagine you could travel back to the 1970s and talk to Jamaicans on the streets of Kingston who were embroiled in a violent gang war that was stoked by the United States specifically with the purpose of destabilizing the newly elected left-wing government. The government, which was insufficiently favorable to free markets for America's taste. Ask them whether or not the American dream has become a global nightmare. Imagine you could ask the 800 civilians about to be murdered in El Mozote by Salvadoran death squads, again, backed by the US, to destabilize a left-wing government that refused to adopt and implement a US-approved neoliberal program. Ask them whether they think the American dream had become a global nightmare. What do you think they would say? What about the tens of thousands of supporters of the democratically elected left-wing Allende government who were subject to torture, interrogation, and eventually execution as they were held prisoner in a soccer stadium during the US-backed coup in Chile? For them, it simply cannot be refuted that the American dream has become a global nightmare. Now, these horrors are not even justified by the excuse of providing for ordinary Americans at the expense of those abroad. I would think that would be a morally reprehensible excuse to begin with, but it doesn't even apply here. The United States suffers from crumbling infrastructure, inadequate health care access, unprecedented mass incarceration, unaffordable housing and homelessness, ballooning consumer debt, continued racial segregation and resegregation, reversals of social progress milestones like abortion rights. There's more on the next page. Ruthless privatization of the welfare state, precipitous union decline, and stagnant wages, to name a few. And I'm sorry, Senator, but no amount of startups can make up for all of that. Look, the American dream has become a nightmare for Americans too. And that's the verbatim quote from Martin Luther King Jr., as you said. And the motion before us is sort of modeled after that wording. And he was right. All right, he was right. And let's not forget that in the last years of his life, Martin Luther King Jr. was speaking against two things increasingly: American imperialism and the merciless pursuit of profit. That is, he was speaking out against the two components I've identified of the dream of the American elite. But the dream of the people, of ordinary people, is alive and well. The inscription at the base of the Statue of Liberty is still legible, and people still harbor in their hearts a hope for a society in which people's basic needs are met and in which people cooperate instead of dominating each other. They have in their hearts a longing for freedom and security for all, a principled commitment to democracy, and a spirit, like I said, of cooperation over domination. And the fact that that dream is alive and well is our best bet for an alternative. I don't think that we can restrict ourselves to saying simply, well, America's not been very good as the global hegemon, so look at the available countries and pick one that would be a better global hegemon. No, I think we need to have a new attitude of cooperation, a new ethos of commitment above all to human flourishing and not to profit. It doesn't exist in any country on earth right now. But that ethos is very necessary. It's incredibly necessary, not only so that all of the suffering, all of the human suffering that I've just mentioned can finally come to an end, but also so that we can combat climate change, which is if it proceeds without intervention, and the United States is not cooperating to address climate change, but if it proceeds without intervention, that is the absolute definition of a global nightmare. Thank you.